Yes, welcome to all of you. Welcome to this event on Do the Dutch Support EU Enlargement with the Western Balkan countries? My name is Louise van Schaik. I'm head of unit for EU and Global Affairs here at the Clingendael Institute. And I'm so happy to see so many of you here. We actually had to close the registration already early on because it was full. And I'm also really pleased to welcome the many people that view this event online through the YouTube link. And I'm so happy that it's possible nowadays to establish such a link in this field of international relations. A special welcome also to the ambassadors of Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Kosovo, and last but not least, Serbia. Thank you for coming and thank you for always working with us so pleasantly. The Dutch position on the Western Balkans, what is the fuss about it? I think it was about 4 years ago that we noticed a huge increase of interest. Organizations from the Western Balkans started to approach us. We saw press becoming more interested, funders becoming more interested and reaching out to us. And we were looking into it and we thought, yeah, it is a fascinating theme for us specialists in international relations, European integration. But what's the fuss, you know? Why do they all focus on the Dutch and not on the Germans or the French or, you know, the bigger countries in the overall scheme of European affairs? Well, it was quickly clear for us that it had to do with our stance. That was perceived slightly critical, strict and fair, or was it strict but fair? And that this was also a reason why the Netherlands was considered by many countries in the region as a crucial country for their path for the European integration perspective. So we started with the Balkan Hub, and that allowed us really to work together with many organizations in the region, to get to know so many wonderful people, some of which are also here today, to have researchers over from think tanks in the region, to work with them here at the Institute, and to really scale up our capacities, our expertise on specific elements, free press, cooperation on many, many issues that the Netherlands and the European Union have with the countries in the Western Balkans. Today, of course, we live in a totally changed time, also with the shock of the war in Ukraine earlier this year. And it's clear that enlargement has received another dimension, and that also the geopolitical significance of the region has changed. But still, the Dutch policy on enlargement is still very much focused on a merit-based approach. How do countries progress in implementing the acquis communautaire? How is the rule of law perceived? But there is nowadays a way greater understanding overall. In policy circles, in political circles, we're joined here today also by politicians from the European Parliament, from the national parliaments, and in general, greater understanding of the region. And we at Clingendael, of course, we feel that we have contributed to that with all the publications that we did with the partners and with others. In all honesty, probably also that, for instance, a famous television show like Wie is de Mol in the Netherlands went to Albania might also have helped to create a bit more of a positive attitude. So today we organize with 3 of the partners this event, and I would like to welcome them in particular. BiEPAG, the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group. I printed it out because I was otherwise afraid that I would make mistakes in the names of your organizations. It's an initiative aiming to promote the European integration of the Western Balkans and the consolidation of democratic open countries in the region. Then the European Fund for the Balkans, an initiative of European foundations that envisage, runs and supports initiatives aimed at strengthening democracy, fostering European integration and affirming the role of the Western Balkans in addressing Europe's emerging challenges. And finally, DPART, a Berlin-based think tank where are you? There are you. That looks at political participation in Europe and public opinion research. And that's, of course, what we're here for today. Today was published a new study on how the Dutch view enlargement. And you've done that before in France, before the war started. And now you focused on the Netherlands, which we think is quite special. Again, what a big country we are. And you're going to present to us the results. And the results include both an analysis of to what extent do the Dutch support enlargement, but also why do people support enlargement and how do they view the region. So that's the first part of the program will be with Dr. Tobias Spuri from BiEPAG. Then we will have a response by the member of the European Parliament, Thijs Reuten. He's from the Social Democrat Party, recently appointed rapporteur for Kosovo. He will give, let's say, his perspective on the findings in the study and to what extent they were surprising for him and how he can also use it in a political way. Then we will have, hopefully, a little bit of time for Q&A or discussion. And then we will go for a lunch here in the hall. And after lunch, we will have a panel with Srodan Sevijuk, I hope I pronounce it correctly, from BiEPAG. Jeroen van Wijngaarden, Member of Parliament in the Netherlands. Angelina Eighorst, Managing Director at the European External Action Service for Europe and Central Asia. Our own Wouter Zwiers, the lead of our Western Balkans hub and our real expert on this topic. And I think the most known European expert on this topic, Florian Bieber from the University of Graz. Very pleased also to have you here at the Clingendael Institute again. And this panel will be moderated by a Dutch journalist, Sophie Derksen. Where is she? Not yet here. So, without further ado, I would like to ask Tobias to take the floor and give his presentation on the study. Maybe we can give him already a bit of applause.
Great. Ambassadors, distinguished guests in the room, and also those following us online. My name is Tobias Spuri. I'm, as Louise said, a research fellow at BiEPAG, and we are a think tank based in Berlin. I mean, also thanks for the nice introduction, and also thanks for hosting us here today in this wonderful room. So the study is called Strict, Fair, and More Open Towards Enlargement, which already foreshadows some of the results regarding how Dutch public opinion is. And just one remark, especially to those online, if you want to tweet or use whatever social media platform, you can find the hashtag here. It is enlargement, and NNL are capitalized for a good reason. So what do we have in the project? So we really want to understand, we didn't just want to ask the question to the Dutch public, do you favor enlargement, yes or no? We really try to understand who is in favor and why people are in favor. And we did not just, and I'm going to talk about the boring stuff, methodology in a second for a tiny bit, but we didn't just talk to the public, to public opinion, but we also talked to Dutch policymakers and discussed some of the preliminary results. So it's also kind of about examining whether there are dissonances between the Dutch public and Dutch policymakers. I mean, Louise already introduced us. Here you see the core group who was really doing this study. And it is the second country we are studying after France, which we studied in 2020. And the report is also online if you are interested in the French results. But obviously there is a big difference, and this is the outbreak of the Russian war in Ukraine. So you're also gonna see some results on this. About the kind of boring stuff, I mean, not for me as a political scientist, but for some people it might be boring. So what we did three things. We had a representative survey in the Netherlands, in which like 1,500 people took part. It was a relatively complex quota design. I'm not going to talk about this, but you can believe me that it's high quality data. We had And the survey was done in April and May 2020, so after the outbreak of the war. We had focus groups, so discussion groups, in Rotterdam in June this year. And there we were already kind of putting people together in one group which have similar views, that you really see how people react towards certain treatments in a way. And we had interviews with Dutch policymakers from July throughout October, so still quite recently. And some of the results are very fresh, as you can imagine. So big question, I think this is kind of the key message. Where does the Dutch public currently stand when it comes to enlargement with the Western Balkan countries? And kind of apologies for the colors because they look different on the laptop from the screen. But so we just asked people, how do you view EU enlargement with the Western Balkans? And you can really see that compared to previous studies, the Dutch public is really split. So there are 5 options, whether you think EU enlargement with the Western Balkans is very good, rather bad, very bad, or people don't know. And if you add up those who favor enlargement, it's 45%. So almost half of the population thinks that it's either a very good thing or a rather good thing. Most people think it's a rather good thing. When it comes to the enlargement skeptics, it's 1/4 of the Dutch public thinks that it's rather bad to have those countries in the EU. 10% think it's a very bad thing. And still you see that 1/5 of the Dutch public thinks or is unsure about whether those countries should join the EU or not. So this is kind of the key finding. But as I said before, we were not just interested in asking this question, are you in favor of the countries joining or not? I think it's also quite crucial to see whether people think that this topic actually matters to them. And so we talk about salience, which means it's not just that the topic is important to them, but it might, for instance, affect their behavior in terms of voting. That it's really a topic that people care about. So what do you see on the top? Again, how people view the Western Balkan countries joining. So you have like 45% in favor, 35 against, and 22% unsure. And the question we also asked whether people feel that if those countries join, that it would affect their lives. So if it's a salient topic to them personally. And what you see is this typology, and we also use this to construct the focus groups. So you have like 15% of the population that think those countries should join, and they think this is a really important topic to me as a person. You have like 30% who want those countries in the EU, but think that this topic is not really of a big concern for them personally. 14% think, okay, we don't want to have those countries, like we as the Netherlands. I mean, I'm not Dutch, I'm just saying this from the Dutch perspective. And they think this is a really crucial topic to them, that something would change if those countries join. And 20% think no to those countries and nothing would change. And again, 22% are unsure. And what we used in the focus groups, so we had the approvers discussing among themselves. We had those who really didn't want to have those countries in the EU and think that this matters personally for them, discussing among themselves, and also for the other 2 groups. So for the disapproval, low salience part, and for the unsure part. What is quite interesting, and I think this is another key finding, that it's not so much about the countries, about the candidate countries, about the Western Balkan countries. I think it's a lot, like when you talk about Dutch public opinion on EU enlargement, it's a lot about how the Dutch view the EU per se in general, and not the candidate countries. I hope you can read this, but we asked the question, how do you view the EU in general? So it was not about enlargement, not about the Western Balkan countries. And what you see, you see here the groups, so this is the overall sample, and you have the 2 approval groups, the 2 disapproval groups, and the unsure group. And what you can really see that those who are in favor of enlargement, for instance, those who really care about the Western Balkan countries joining, I mean, it's like 74% think the EU is a good thing, compared to the disapproval groups, where it's just 1 out of 3 persons. They view the EU positively. So I think it's like what you can really see is that when you ask the Dutch public, and this is not just the Dutch, I mean, it was similar in France, they view enlargement through the lens of how they view the EU in general. So I think it has a lot to do with how the EU per se is perceived. what we also asked is how people trust either the Dutch National Parliament and also the European Parliament. And you can see a similar trend. I mean, overall, like half of the Dutch population trusts the Parliament, like the National Parliament here in this city, and a bit less the European Parliament. But you can really see that the two approval groups are those trusting the parliaments per se more compared to the other three groups. And I think it's also interesting that the approval high salience group, they even trust the European Parliament more than they trust the national parliament. I think there is a lot of nuance to this. And it's some quotes from the focus groups. So there was one person from the approval group saying like, collaboration is really good and also pulling up other countries, talking about the candidate countries, towards welfare will be great as well. So what you can see in the focus groups is that especially those two approval groups, they really believe in the transformative power of the European Union. That this is a great project and collaboration, working together, will be good for all countries, also those who might potentially join at a later stage. When it comes to how the disapprovers view the EU, I mean, I'm just going to read out the quote. It's, the whole regulation of Brussels is oppressive and suffocating. So they really don't like Brussels as a term. And that's also probably why they don't favor enlargement so much. Another crucial thing, and I think this is also kind of a Dutch thing, and you talked about criteria, strict and fair or strict but fair, is the importance of the accession criteria. And you see that a lot of people, so we ask people, do you think a country should join if the criteria are fulfilled? And 66% of the Dutch public think yes, if a country fulfills the criteria, if all boxes are officially checked, then a country should join. Again, if you look at the approval groups, 90% of those people think if the criteria are fine, those countries should join. I think what is quite interesting is if you look at the disapproval groups, because here you see almost 50% of those who don't want to have the countries, they think if I'm convinced that the criteria are fulfilled, I'm happy with the countries joining. So I think this is quite crucial, that, and probably a very Dutch thing, but not exclusively, that they really care about the criteria, not just to be fulfilled, but also to be monitored. That was also something from the groups. And here again, some quotes, again from disapprovals. We should be very strict in the implementation and the checking, but if this is done, although I'm against it, then it's fine that if those countries actually join. And again, from the approval group, you see if those countries implement reforms, they benefit from all the great things the EU has to offer. So again, there is kind of this very positive image on the EU and this belief in the transformative power of the EU. What we also did is not just asking about the EU, but also about kind of knowledge of the EU accession procedure, but also the Western Balkan countries. And now the ambassadors should be quite strong because the Dutch don't know so much about the Western Balkan countries, which might not be a surprise to you. Because what we did, for instance, this is just one of the examples. So we gave them 3 maps. And you don't have to be a statistician, but you know, by chance, if you pick one of those maps randomly, it would be 33%. And we did this, we offered them 3 maps. So on the left side, you have Turkey, you have Syria, you have the South Caucasus. In the middle, you have the Western Balkan countries. And on the right-hand side, you have Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovakia, and so on. And at least 42% managed to pick the right countries. What is also interesting, if you then look at those groups I just presented to you, they were all equally good or bad. So like, it was not that those who really approve EU enlargement are the ones saying, yes, okay, it's in the middle, these are the countries. So they knew equally little or a lot, comparing where you stand, about where those countries stand. And I think it's also a lot about something, it's not just about geography, like maps, it's a lot about mental maps, where those countries actually are. Like here, one person from the focus group said, I don't have much knowledge of these countries, it isn't close to home. Other people were saying, okay, those countries are kind of behind God's back, something like this. So it's really about personal connections in a way, but not just about knowledge per se. And I'm going to show this to you in a second. Another thing is, we also asked about knowledge about EU enlargement procedure. We asked 4 questions, and they are all, like, we gave them 4 statements, and you might know that all are actually wrong. So the first one is, if the Western Balkan countries join, Turkey will also join. So if it would be kind of a bulk enlargement. The second one is, decisions on the enlargement are taken for all Western Balkans at the same time. So it's either all of them or none. The third one is that the Netherlands could be overruled. That, like, the Netherlands don't have a say when the decision is made on enlargement, that they could be overruled. And the last one is a bit about geography, that the Western Balkan countries are double in terms of population compared to the Netherlands, although it's roughly the same. And at least for the first 2, there is a majority who could say that those statements are actually not correct. But I think especially the third one, that just less than 40% of the Dutch know that the Netherlands can't be overruled, because obviously all countries have to agree to this, is something to worry in a way. And also when we talked to a lot of Dutch policymakers, it was really about knowledge, that people lack knowledge. So if you are a European Union who wants to keep a political support, people need to understand how it works. And I think this was one of the factors a lot of people worried about, that people don't know much about it. So when it's not knowledge, if it's not knowledge, it might be personal experience. And you talked about who is the mole. I'm not going to use the name in Dutch. So it's really about whether people kind of are confronted with those countries. Not like in terms of enlargement per se, but if those countries kind of appear on their radar. So we asked 2 things: whether people have traveled to those countries, or at least to one of those countries, and also whether they know somebody from the Western Balkans personally. And what you can see is, again, in the approvable group, especially among those who really care about the enlargement, who think that this is a personal, important thing for them, you can really see that more of them have traveled to the Western Balkans, and almost 50% of them know somebody personally from the Western Balkans. So it's really about personal ties, not just about knowledge. And there's somebody who was actually unsure about Western Balkan enlargement, but she said, the seaside is lovely. If you travel inward, there's so much going on. So she was really positive. I mean, it's not defined what is going on there. I mean, this might also be up to the discussion afterwards. But she was very pleased about, I know which country it actually was. Last slide. I mean, especially when you follow, for instance, Eurobarometer data, and they also have a question on enlargement, which might be a bit more vague because it's about future enlargement and not about countries, like specific countries. You see that from the second last Eurobarometer, from winter 21-22, where the Dutch public opinion was about 1/3 being in favor of future enlargement. And when you compare this to the latest version of Eurobarometer, there was also a major jump. So now, at least according to Eurobarometer data, it's 56% of the Dutch being in favor. So even more than in our study, which also might be due to the fact that it's just about future enlargement per se and not about specific countries. But the jump from winter to summer was a plus of 24%. So 1/4 of the Dutch public shifted their opinion. And we also were able to examine this in our survey and the focus groups, but also to talk to Dutch policymakers about this. And obviously now the Russian war in Ukraine comes in, because we asked people 2 things about the war. Whether they actually worry about the war, which is more general. And then the second part is also whether the EU should enlarge quickly because of the war. So this question was not about the Western Balkan countries, it was about enlargement per se. And what you see is that all groups worry about the war, some 80%. But then when it comes to what the EU should actually do in terms of enlargement, you see that the 2 approval groups, again, close to 50% or 43% think now the EU should enlarge for geopolitical reasons. Which is obviously not the case for the disapproval high salience group. It's just 7% thinking that now it's time to enlarge quickly because of the war. And I think this is also something, if you look at the bottom quote, it's from somebody who was really against enlargement with the Western Balkans. But she said, the more we team up with other countries, the better it is. So it's really about, like, okay, now there is an external threat in terms of Russia in the perception, and we need more countries. And also the Western Balkan countries are welcome in this regard. And also from the interviews with Dutch policymakers, you could really see that this person was saying the war in Ukraine had just started, and everyone was looking at the Western Balkans in a more geopolitical way. So it was really about Russia in a way, kind of also being present in some Western Balkan countries. So the war was really one of the things that might, is kind of the driver of EU enlargement, like perception of EU enlargement. Good. I think I'm fine time-wise. So I'm going to come to the conclusion. And obviously there's much more in the study, and I'm happy to answer the questions afterwards. But what we see is, in terms of our title, that the Dutch have become more open towards enlargement. And it's just a minority of Dutch people who opposes enlargement and who thinks that this opposition towards enlargement is really something they care about. Then it's also what I also just walked you through, that like, people really view the discussions about EU enlargement through a broader EU lens. So it's really about how they view the EU per se, and not about how they perceive enlargement, and also, in our case, the Western Balkan countries. I mean, strict but fair really matters. I mean, there was some interview partner who said, if the Dutch public knows anything about enlargement, that it is that we have to be strict and fair. Although, and we also examined this, people really care about criteria. They might not necessarily know what the criteria are actually about, but they know that it's important that they have to be fulfilled. So this is one of the key findings. In terms of knowledge versus personal experience, it's not so much about knowledge, because all groups did equally good or not so good. It's really about personal experiences. And also some interview partners were saying, like the TV show, Who's the Mole, really helped because it put Albania on the map. Others said some European football championship, which took place in Tirana, it really helped because, like, probably it also helped that Feyenoord Rotterdam was playing there, but it was really well organized. So the Dutch think I think this helped in terms of how Albania is viewed. And obviously, the war in Ukraine is one of the driving factors, because it kind of meant such a change to not just the Dutch, but to the European Union, of course. And I think it is really to be seen how long-lasting this effect is. Like, we also don't know how long the war will last, but is it just like a short-term effect that people really think, okay, now we have to enlarge because of the war? So if somebody is happy to fund this project in 1 year, we are happy to do this again in the Netherlands. Great. That was a very quick walk through the presentation. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the comments and happy to answer all kind of questions that might pop up.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wow, this was a really great overview. I should perhaps also add that in another television program a couple of years ago, the Dutch were asked when they were on holidays to show on the map where they were, on their holiday destinations, and also where the Netherlands was located on the map. And yeah, it was just shocking to see how many people didn't manage to put out on the map their own holiday destination or the Netherlands. So don't be too appalled by this. It's probably more a show of bad geography lessons at primary school in the Netherlands. Although I must say that my kids are really tortured with geography. So I hope that in the future they will do better. We're really pleased to have Thijs Roten with us, a member of the European Parliament, just appointed as a rapporteur for the visa liberalization issue with regards. Just the visa liberalization, a small matter, as we all know, and also Wouter has published several papers on that, also on the French perspective and the Dutch perspective. But we're really pleased to have you here, member of the Social Democrats, the same party as Commissioner Timmermans. Perhaps that's good to add. And real interest in this topic, and really looking forward to hear what you have to say in response to the study.
Thank you. Thank you. I will use this because I had my notes last night in the train from Strasbourg. So I use the iPad. But thank you, Louise, for the introduction. Tobias, Excellencies, distinguished guests. Yes, the EU enlargement is the Union's most important foreign policy instrument. There is simply no other means which brings European democracy, stability and prosperity, which promotes it better than enlargement, voluntary integration into our Union. Now, this is of course a very commonplace expression, nothing new, but also what Thomas showed in the last couple of slides, if Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine must have learned us something, it is that it must be by now clear to anyone that especially any country which has spent the last couple of years, the past decade, resisting EU enlargement should now wake up. And apparently also the broader public sees that enlargement could and in my opinion is a very important tool to promote stability in the whole European continent. And that previous decade that I mentioned was valuable time. And I think we lost valuable time. And that has cost us dearly, because whether it concerns the Kosovo visa liberalization or veto after veto for North Macedonia or the appeasement of increasingly authoritarian regional actors, the credibility of the European project has suffered because of the inaction in that past decade. Because credibility is a two-way street. Where the people of the Western Balkans risk losing faith in enlargement, a majority of the people across the Netherlands may have never had this faith over these years. Or did they? Because the question that comes to me also reading research as did it change apart from the war in Ukraine, or was it more positive than politicians thought or was convenient for them to believe? So that could be also a topic of further research. And Tobias, and of course, your research demonstrates a lot of things for this, and it's exactly what we politicians need. Also, that different lens of perception. And I will not highlight the points because you already did. I will try to comment briefly on them. So the point that struck me most was the huge impact of this increased familiarity with the region. And so it's far from surprising. The Dutch have this saying, onbekend maakt onbemind. If you don't know it, then you might be loving it or at least start to appreciate it. And with that lack of knowledge, people will use the general issues they already associate with the region, or that are brought to them by people who conveniently want to use these issues also for their political purposes. And what's more, I think that these associations with some of these countries are indeed gradually changing due to more openness, due to the possibility of traveling. And that is why this small issue of the Kosovo visa liberalization, and especially the position that the Netherlands has been taking in that issue, is only 1 million European citizens left that do not have it. And the Netherlands have used that issue to demonstrate this toughness, this strictness. Yeah, we are very good with strict, but the fair was also part of the strict and fair. And it is not fair what has been done and what has been also damaging this credibility. Second point, reflecting on the research and process, or the dominance of, as you say, the EU itself. It's not so much about the countries; it's about the knowledge of the process and the criteria, of course, that so much to the European public. And I think that is an important point also to work on, also for every politician, because to me, I'm proponent of enlargement, you might have guessed by now, but the most important thing is that people have the ability or the possibility to have an informed decision. an informed opinion about that. I always say also to people, it make you love every single one of the Western Balkan countries, but I want you to see the interest that you have with enlargement as a Dutch citizen, as a European citizen, but also understand, in my words, the moral obligation that we have to at least give the countries also a fair chance to join this community of values. So, well, that ties in directly with this negative public perception, or the politicians or the policy makers thinking there is more negative public perception than there actually is. Yes, of course, and I'm not shying away from the difficult issues on this, because we should not underestimate the role of Poland and Hungary and the process around the rule of law crisis that was there. And it is something to address. Also, to need to explain processes, to explain, for example, the central role of chapters 23 and 24. I think if you ask 100 citizens out on the streets, 99 will not know what you were talking about. And so we need to rephrase that, create a narrative around that could make it also contributing to a more positive attitude. And well, I think the geopolitical necessity of enlargement, of course, if I phrase it like that, that will probably also not make the biggest impression. So we have to rephrase that and say, look, what's happening now is not something that is a standalone event. What's happening now in Ukraine is the consequence of 10, 15 years of ignoring authoritarians, actually appeasing them, not acting when it came to Georgia, not acting when it came to the Crimea. Let's not make these mistakes again. And the same goes for the rule of law problems we have with Hungary. We adopted another resolution yesterday on Hungary, but we should have acted 12 years ago when Orban started with his plan, because he had a plan and we didn't respond adequately. I will round up, because I hope there will be some time for questions as well. But let me briefly take you also to the actuality of this week, because I think just days ago in Strasbourg we adopted a report outlining recommendations timely for this time, for the effects of the war also in Ukraine, because we said as a European Parliament we need to revitalize the EU enlargement policy. And the primary among these recommendations is the introduction of qualified majority for key elements in the enlargement process. So, of course, there will be a final judgment, but we should lift the veto from all the different steps of the process, because that opens a road for frivolous vetoes of member states keen on using the Union to fight their bilateral battles candidate member states, or even between each other. And that is very destructive. And another recommendation, we need more, we need a gradual phase-in of candidate countries into the Union. It benefits, then the citizens can already feel the benefits of parts of the internal market, for example. And this phase-in must be reversible upon governments of candidates which fail to implement or even backslide. So it should be conditional. And finally, it's only a few of the recommendations. Finally, the report sets a very clear deadline for ongoing accession negotiations by 2030. And we cannot afford to let this process drag out endlessly. And each of these reforms would enhance the credibility of this enlargement process, both within the Western Balkans, because of the advantages that they already feel, and if it's communicated clearly and consistently, also in a country like the Netherlands, also domestically, it will reinforce. Reiterate what with the EU is our most consequential foreign policy instrument, but it's also a crucial instrument for domestic policy. And I think that really links to the atrocious war in Ukraine. The borders of the European Union are our borders. They are the Dutch borders. And moving into the realization of our strategic environment, we cannot but lend our full support to the reform of the enlargement process, and that is for the people of the Western Balkans, certainly, but as much also for those citizens already part of the European Union. So thank you again for this great piece of research, and my call would be also to build on the nuance that you showed in your research to the information and actions, direct familiarity, and is on the process that people need to understand. So build on that, and I call also on the government of this beautiful country, of my country, to also not shy away from actually being really convincingly positive. I was very pleased that Mark Rutte traveled to North Macedonia and Albania. But what I want him to do also is to go on a television show in the Netherlands and say why he did that, why it is important for the Netherlands, and why it is not something to shy away from. And I'm sure there will be a couple of questions. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to me.
Please take a seat. Take a seat.
Want to hear you?
Yeah, that would be nice. No, thank you so much. And yeah, I had to think almost about countries, you know, that are taking an exam through the new enlargement methodology, and maybe it's good indeed to set a deadline for that, because it cannot, you know, go on forever. So I think that's a really fair point, and I'm also very grateful for the many other points that you made. I wanted to open for questions, but I first wanted to ask you, Tobias, why did you, BiEPAG, based in Berlin, choose to focus this study on the Netherlands? What was the reason in the first place?
I think it's really about, like, I mean, it's easy to study those countries who are more in favor of enlargement, and it's probably also not so exciting to study them. I mean, also the reason why we chose France was also because they're very critical about EU enlargement with the Western Balkans. So it's really about focusing on those countries who are critical towards enlargement, to understand why those countries are against it.
Yeah, was really the reason, the expectation of a critical attitude in society.
Plus, one sentence. I mean, when we started the project to plan it last year, so obviously prior to the war in Ukraine, and we were obviously not expecting this, but you could really see that the war made a big impact on public opinion on this topic.
Yeah. All right, thanks. So that's what I already thought, but I thought it would be good to, from the research perspective, to point it out. Thijs Reuten, you mentioned it would be good that Prime Minister Rutte would be on television, and of course the question for politicians is always what's to gain about, you know, profiling on specific topics, mentioning them. And you've just been appointed as a rapporteur for the visa liberalization Kosovo. What was your motivation to do that, to take up that position?
Well, it is a relatively small topic within the broad array of topics, but I thought, well, let's take on this challenge as a Dutch MEP, because I get asked questions very frequently about this. And yes, the position of the European Parliament, by the way, is a large majority of 550, 600 seats supports granting of this visa liberalization already for 4 years, because Kosovo fulfilled the criteria for 4 years. So it's not that I have to do still a lot of negotiating in the European Parliament. We are now basically waiting for the member states to adopt the already widely underpinned position of the European Commission that Kosovo has done everything to fulfill the criteria. So this is not a difficult negotiating topic, but it is a topic that for me also in my conversations here in the Netherlands demonstrates this general attitude of the last 10 years that actually started with Jean-Claude Juncker saying, "Oh, now we're done with enlargement," and irrespective of what you think about it, that is a very bad start of any discussion, because it gave also the signal probably to many, including the Dutch government, say, okay, let's back out of this. Let's take a relaxed stance and not move too much. On the contrary, use it for probably internal political discussions. And yes, as I said, I generally see that also this centre-right government in the Netherlands now is not fundamentally opposed against enlargement. I'm not convinced of that. I think they are in favor also of enlargement in general. But if you look at the Dutch public, you need to also explain that and also communicate in a positive way about it. And that's why I like this file of the visa liberalization, because I think it's crystal clear for everyone that you can have the chance to talk for 1 minute. I can explain why it is ridiculous that we do not do that. We have granted it to Nicaragua, we granted it to Venezuela, but we don't give it to 1 million Kosovars.
Right, that's loud and clear. Thank you so much. Let's open up. Are there any questions? Wouter, would you like to say something? Any questions? Yeah, please, our partner from the region. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alexandra Toman, it's European Fund for the Balkans. I would have a short comment regarding one of the findings, like they should join once they fulfill all criteria. I mean, if that's Dutch, then I'm Dutch too. I think that we should, in this context, then really redefine skeptical countries towards enlargement and friends of enlargement, because that's what the accession process is about. It's a transformative power, and it's about the criteria. The fact that they haven't, that they have been traded for different interests over the past years would open a different topic. And you said about pleasing authoritarians also in different contexts. How do you see that regarding the Western Balkans, if we know that we have democracy deficits, that we have state captures, and that, again, other interests were given priority against democracy? So I would be interested to hear your comment on that.
So, the clear civil society voice on democratization, please.
Well, to me, the question, yes. No, I think that, well, the consequence of, as I said, I'm not opposed to the strict and fair approach, but the emphasis in the Netherlands is on the strict. And I want to see also the fair. And fair would have been to unequivocally support North Macedonia when they were ready for starting the negotiations, unequivocally support Albania. And strict would mean, contrary to what many European member states, including the Netherlands, are doing, is also to be strict on people who do not fulfill, on the contrary, who are backsliding. Because, well, I mean, there are, as you all know, maybe better than me, but the 6 countries we talk about are so different also between them. And backsliding in one is something different than in the other. I mean, the reasons for it are different. I had the pleasure to be the head of delegation of the observation mission to the recent Serbian elections. But if I say, and I can demonstrate that, and I can argue that, and that is not because I'm against Serbia, because that is how it's perceived a lot also among Serbian politicians. I'm in favor of Serbian accession, more than anyone probably in the Netherlands. But if I see that the election process actually backsliding in terms of freedom of media, in terms of the clear signals and facts about abuse of the system, the electoral system, the electoral lists, etc., then we need to act upon that and not say, oh well, but yeah, now we'll see. And that is the problem that I have with the current commissioner, because that is also an interesting perspective on watching to these different European countries. A lot of European countries are officially very much pro-enlargement. But what kind of enlargement? Is it enlargement of countries that actually are maybe look more like them? Mr. Orban is very much pro-enlargement, but he wants as many unstable countries or fundamentally not respecting the rule of law into the European Union. That's not the enlargement that we want. That's not the enlargement that the Western Balkan countries are seeking. And I think that also that is a topic of research. How is that perceived also in these respective countries? So, but to come back to your question, I think that this point is fundamental, and we need to also involve the civil society in that, because when I'm in the Western Balkans and I've visited each country several times, I always try to talk also to the civil society organizations there that are fighting the corruption from bottom up, that are trying to change also the democratic culture within the country. So I think that is a fundamental part of investing in enlargement that also should be taken up by countries like the Netherlands.
All right, thank you so much. We have only time for one more questions. I have the ambassador of Albania. Please. Yeah, that's okay.
Good morning to everybody. It's still morning. Thank you very much for your a very interesting presentation. Thank you for your remarks, Thijs. Thank you, Tobias, for what you brought us today. I don't have a question, but when I was following your presentation, there are some striking issues, and I want to highlight them now, and I also want to reflect, to have a moment of reflection for us as politicians, civil society, representatives of governments, embassies and everything. It's striking me when you say that the public opinion in the Netherlands cannot find the Western Balkans in the map. And I do subscribe to your point of view, because this is also my finding, and it is very sad to see that. But haven't we made a mistake, a small mistake, when referring to our region as Western Balkans? And this is a very philosophical question, and it's about semantics, and it's about how you present it to the public, because the public will see it in the way you present it. Well, if you present a region and you say, this is Western Balkans, do you want European Union to accept them and enlarge with Western Balkans? And people don't know about it, they think it's another continent. The fact that we are, I mean, everything is so much in the name. The fact that we associate Western Balkans with a region that is in the Southeast Europe, I think that is where the beginning of a big problem. I myself, as the ambassador of Albania in the Netherlands, I do not associate myself with Western Balkans, to be honest with you. I have, as Albania, you said all the countries are different. I don't find any Balkans or Western Balkans in my country. What I find in my country is Southeast Mediterranean Europe. And when you say to somebody in the to the public, this is Southeast Europe, do you want it to be? And then, this is my second remark, is it enlargement or is it inclusion? Because if you see the map, it's not enlargement. Enlargement is Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, that is enlargement. For our region, this is inclusion. Just look at the map and see how we are surrounded by EU countries, and that's what I want to say to you. Maybe it will make your study next time easier.
So much. I think it's a very fair point, and it also reminded me of the time about 15 years ago, no, more than 15 years ago, when of course we had the previous big enlargement round. And first these countries were kind of labeled as Eastern Europe, and then it became Central Europe.
Europe is in the name. With Western Balkans, there is no Europe in the name.
No, I think it's a very fair point. So we will give the two speakers the final opportunity to give reaction, and then we will close off.
I give my time to a final question then.
Okay, please. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Oh, maybe I don't need this. Hi, good morning. I'm the ambassador of Serbia to the Netherlands, and thank you for the presentation. I find it very interesting because actually I think one of my conclusions by listening to it is that the Dutch are quite fair in the end. I mean, as much as we may sometimes, be thinking of them as critical, as demanding, etc., but in the end they're quite fair. The problem, however, at least from the perspective of the people in the Balkans, and I think it's not only Serbia, it's the others as well, is that when we talk about the criteria, and I would like to hear both your opinion about it, there is very often an overwhelming feeling that it's a moving target, that these criteria are changing. I mean, of course, circumstances are changing things, but still we need to have a clarity on the criteria, and we need to know that once they are fulfilled, and I agree, of course, the fulfillment of the criteria is important, that we can really count on becoming a member, all of us. So this is something I'm interested in hearing, and I have to make a remark on the impression of our elections. Of course, it's your opinion, and as such, it's absolutely legitimate. I would just, I have to say that there are reports, different reports, not only by the European Commission, but by the OSCE, by the ODIHR, who also monitored these elections, and in none of those reports I saw the word backsliding. I saw recommendations, of course, for the improvement of the election process, and this is something we obviously have to work on. But in none of these reports I saw that. Of course, as I said, it's your opinion, it's fine, but I think that we need to have an objective look. And especially by the organizations who have the authority to not that I'm saying you don't, I'm just saying that we have to differ the relevant reports from opinions which are of course always legitimate. Thank you.
Right. So, final word, and then I will close the session. Please.
Okay, do I need the mic, or is it fine for me?
Yeah, it's fine.
For me, it's fine. Okay, it's not, okay. Just about your remark, which is well taken. I mean, what we did, like two things. What we also showed, like we didn't just show those maps to people, but we showed them also maps which displayed all EU member states, and then also the Western Balkan countries highlighted. And then really people said, hey, there's a hole in Europe. So we are kind of, why are those countries not included? And you have to the eastern border, at least to some of the countries, you have Bulgaria and Romania. So this also visualized it very strongly to people. About the wording, I mean, I agree to you, but what we also did is, like we asked people at the very beginning about how they view enlargement with the Western Balkans, but at the end, we use different terms. We asked them again the same question, and you could already see that some were switching their opinion, but not because of the wording, because we asked integration, accession, and enlargement, for instance. And the share of how people view this process was always the same, independent from how the term is used. So in this case, there was no effect of the term. And about criteria, there's just speaking from our research, you see that like many Dutch really care about the criteria, but they don't know much about them, like because you used the Copenhagen criteria, like the official term and so on, and many were surprised what Copenhagen has to do with this, in a way. But I mean, it's also very technical. I mean, to be honest. But I think that's also why, if people are not aware of what the criteria, like the Copenhagen criteria, are per se, they might also not be aware of that this is might be a moving target, in a way. It's just speaking from like public opinion research.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
On the moving target, I mostly call it changing the rules during the game, and that is typically what's happening also in the Kosovo visa liberalization, because now ETIAS is put on the table, which is totally new, not even functioning for Europe, for the European Union itself, but now it's certainly a added condition. But we'll see how that plays out. On the Serbian elections, well, of course, I have had many of these discussions also with the ambassador in Brussels. I was part of a independent and a neutral observatory mission, including the OSCE, including ODIHR, and the first paragraph of our statement and of the report is very clear, so everyone can read that for himself. And then there is also consistent reporting over the years from Freedom House. And yes, I know that commonly in Serbia is referred to as just an NGO. To me, it's not. It's a respected independent institution that monitors democratic situation and the rule of law and the fundamental rights. Because the fundamental rights are a crucial part of a crucial chapter in the negotiations. And I want to be very clear on this, and I already said it. To me, and my colleague of Renew said it in the meeting that we had just the other day with the Serbian parliamentary delegation in Strasbourg in the European Parliament. It is not because we say it. You have to want this because of the Serbian people. The Serbian people deserve institutions that are free from corruption, that are free from undue interference by the ruling government. And that can be any ruling government, should not just be limited to the current ruling government. But that is what is fundamentally necessary. You owe that to the Serbian people. That's why we do this. And to me, it would be great if Serbia would again become the front runner in the enlargement and become that country that will join the European Union. I hope that it will happen. But we need also to be honest as friends to each other about what we see happening also on the background, but also sometimes in the forefront of the debate. So let's continue the discussion on that, and I'm sure we will get further also together.
I just wanted to say I see a lot of scope for further discussion over lunch. But before we go there, I would like to thank not only the speakers, Tobias, Thijs, but also all of you for participating. I also wanted to, because in the afternoon we have an external moderator, I also wanted to make use of this opportunity just to thank again the partners, also Milena and Alexandra, and also Wouter, Camille, and Joris in the back for organizing this event. So maybe a round of applause for all of them, and then we go for lunch. Thank you.
Ja, precies.
Holy silence, so I believe that's the moment for us to start. Am I understandable for all of you in the room? Yes? Good. Welcome for the second part for today's program. My name is Sophie Derksen. I'm a journalist and radio host here to moderate the second half of this day. Welcome back for all of you. You've had some lunch, you've been able to digest some of the results that we heard before the break. I'm very pleased to welcome our panelists today. Angelina Eichhorst, Managing Director at the European External Action Service. Jeroen van Wijngaarden, Member of Parliament for the Dutch Liberals, VVD. Wouter Zweers from Clingendael Institute. Florian Bieber. Srdjan Svijic, right? That's the way. Good. I'm going to practice. I'll introduce all of you further when we get to our conversations. Let me just give you a brief outline for the house rules for today. Since we have 5 panelists, we'll use the full hour for our conversation here on stage. The second half, we'll talk further about the study and what it implies for politicians, policy makers, mainly with you, Angelina and Jeroen. But we'll start off zooming in on some remarkable results as we've been seeing them presented before the break. And that will be mainly you, Florian and Srdjan. And of course, Wouter, you're present with all of us today, being from Clingendael. Let's start with an introductory round so we know who we have here on stage. Angelina, starting with you, you've been working in Brussels since the 1990s, amongst others on the Western Balkans. You smile, why? Rub it in. Rub it in. I was curious, you have been able to see the conclusions. Does the study reflect your own impressions of how the Dutch look at EU enlargement?
Let me see how
Is it switched on?
Work.
Let me see. I believe it's... Can we have some... Yeah. Yes, we do have sound. Yes, there you go.
Very briefly, I'm pleasantly surprised by the results. It gives me hope. It actually gives me hope that there will be more understanding in the Netherlands why enlargement is important, why the Southeastern Europe is part of our family, and that could actually over time also help us in the work we do in Brussels with all the candidates and the partners. So thanks a lot to the team, and as I said before, I think this should be done in every member state of the European Union, just to get a better sense of what people really think and feel.
Would you initiate it?
Somebody needs to pay for this.
That's why I ask.
European Union is a player, not always a payer.
Thank you for that first reaction. We'll be back with you. Jeroen, Member of Parliament for the Dutch Liberal Party, VVD, with European affairs in your portfolio, actually. What strikes you in the report?
I was also pleasantly surprised. It would be interesting to see how the results would change over the years.
Pleasantly surprised by what exactly? By the positive?
There is relatively good support. I think it's for a region that is relatively unknown. And so that's interesting, and I think there is a link between the two. I think if people would go there more often, even on holiday, that would have a huge influence on the results. But that, of course, is speculation from my side. It's up to confirmed, I hear. So that would help.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
But speaking about the dissonances between the public and policymakers, politicians, what were the ones that really struck you when you read the report?
I am not so sure if I would see a dissonance between what policymakers think and what the public at large think.
Actually, your colleague, well, Mr. Reuten, let's say colleague from the political side, said maybe there is a dissonance. Maybe we politicians, he made a we out of all of you, have been thinking too negative about the appreciation.
Yes, but then of course politicians have a responsibility towards their constituents that requires them to look beyond just a simple, with all due respect, survey question. So we have to, and I think that's where the dissonance might come from. But that's a dissonance which can be explained by the different responsibilities.
Okay, good. Well, I hear a lot of questions coming up already, but let's say we'll save them for the second part of this hour. Let's zoom in a bit on the study and on the making of that study. Wouter Zweers, you're a research fellow here at Clingendael's EU Research Unit with a special focus on the Western Balkans, coordinating Clingendael's Balkans Hub, as Louise has introduced to us previously. In that role, you gave your input in one of the preparing meetings for this study, if I'm informed well. What was your contribution? Did you warn the researchers for the Dutch?
Well, not that much actually, but because I didn't have a full overview myself, of course, of how the Dutch think about enlargement. I mean, I speak to friends and acquaintances, and they have some ideas. But I was actually also very eager to see the results of this study. What I gave as an input is that we should, in any case, look at Wie is de Mol program, whether it made a change, but also this documentary series, De Tranen van Tito, that was made by a Dutch journalist with roots in the region. So,
why did you find him so important?
Well, it's interesting to see whether if the region, when the Balkans or Southeast Europe, as you say, when it's represented in popular media and in popular culture and all these kinds of game shows, etc., whether that also makes a difference in the perceptions. And I think that the study also really shows that it makes a difference if people feel at least a personal connection to the region. And this is something that these sort of popular media shows can at least contribute to, right?
And about warnings for, let's say, about the Dutch, what was your practical instruction for the team, the international team reviewing us?
Yeah. I mean, I think we gave some input also on the specific language, but that's more the technical stuff, right? To make sure that the translation is exactly right. So that also to make sure that there's not the data do not change because the translation is different from what it should be. But other than that, I don't think I had very specific warnings about the landscape. Although I expected the results also to be slightly more negative. So,
right.
Yeah.
Picking up on that one, going to Florian Bieber next to you, professor in Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz, coordinating the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, BiEPAG. You've been looking, obviously, at these successive studies that have confirmed negative attitudes of Dutch public towards EU enlargement. Can you just briefly summarize, also being from Luxembourg originally, working in Austria, what struck you in these earlier studies coming up with this negative attitudes?
And I think, it's not just in the Netherlands. It's broader in the European Union. If you look across the European Union, the Eurobarometer always suggests that EU citizens are skeptical about enlargement, including in the country where I live, Austria. There's a similar kind of negative view. But we always got a sense that this is really just scraping the surface, because citizens are not asked when the countries join. Because they're asked, are you in favor of joining? But it's not asked like, next year or in 10 years. So it's completely disconnected from the reality of joining, because nobody is going to join tomorrow. But citizens often take the question as if it means, do you want the country to join the next day? And I would say no, to that as well. So I think that's the wrong question in a certain way. And the second one is they ask about enlargement in general. So it includes countries like Turkey, for example, which in many EU countries is rather seen quite differently and, for obvious reasons, and more critically than the Western Balkans. So in Austria, for example, there is skepticism, but if you ask, which country are in favor of joining, there is a majority for all of the Western Balkan countries, and the biggest negative view is towards Turkey. So, that's of course worth looking into why is Turkey so negatively viewed, but for the Western Balkans it means there's a lot less skepticism when you actually dig one level deeper. So what we realized, and this is something where this study is grown out of, is to say we actually have to take citizens' opinions more seriously and dig one level deeper than from this kind of superficial knowledge from which people across Europe say EU citizens are skeptical about enlargement. And it's simply not true. And I think if you take the hardest case, the case of the Netherlands, which is one of the more skeptical countries, also one where it's politically relevant because the institutions are, the parliament is very much involved in EU policy making, then for us this was, in a certain way, if we can show here that it's more complicated than just outright skepticism, then this is a message well beyond the Netherlands. It's a message for all the other countries where people think their publics are skeptical, and where in fact they might be more open and more, in a certain way, receptive to enlargement than we thought.
Next to your neighbor, Srđan Cvijić, colleague, right, at BiEPAG, and also president of the International Advisory Committee of the Belgrade Center for Security Policy. We, the Dutch, are a hard case, as we've just heard from Florian, but you also did the research, you're one of the authors, I should state, of this study, but you've also worked on the previous study on another hard case, France. How did that experience shape your process in doing this study?
Well, we wanted to do actually both at the same time, and more, maybe I didn't press the...
I think you should switch it on, otherwise borrow the one Florian, please.
Yeah, so we wanted to do two and more at the same time, but unlike the simple yes and no questions that are asked in the Eurobarometer, this research is really expensive. So to do it in a number of EU member states, it costs enormous amounts of money, so we couldn't. And when we started in France, I think we were together, Florian, at an event in Paris in February 2019. And we were speaking at that event, and it was at the time, you would remember, when both France and the Netherlands were blocking Albania and North Macedonia in their opening of the accession talks. And what we were given by the French politicians as a reason for that blocking was, we are facing the European Parliament elections, and they said it, well, actually the person was speaking at the panel with us. We are facing the European Parliament elections, and we cannot afford to lose a percentage point or two or more because of this issue. And this really struck me personally, because I know France very well. My father was French, and any French person that I know intuitively, as Walter was saying, doesn't really care about this issue. So this is why we started, and this is what I think the main conclusion that brings the results of the two countries together. Whereas in France, the people in our research were more skeptical. In the Netherlands, they're not. We had the Ukraine war in the midst. That was before the Ukraine war. But I think the common and most important conclusion is that this issue is not salient at all politically. It means that when the Dutch or the French go out and vote, whatever the government does or this issue is not going to shape the way in which they vote on the Western Balkans. With Turkey is very different. In France, it was extremely different. In the Netherlands, a bit less so. It's a more salient issue, but we can go into that if somebody's interested. Yeah.
Yes, we'll do that in a bit. I want to start off, with your permission, with this more positive, well, at least the tilting towards more positive attitudes that you found in this study. We've seen the statistics previously before the break, but I'd like you, as one of the authors, to elaborate a bit more on what exactly is it, how do people motivate these positive expectations that they have? Can you just give it a bit more color than just the statistic that we've seen?
Yeah, I can say for both those that agree and that don't, as I said, the common denominator is if you support the EU, if you support the Dutch institutions, the parliament, government, you will support enlargement, and vice versa as well. In the focus groups we did in Rotterdam, we had a speaker from the high salience disapprover group, so people who are really against it and it matters to them, they're a minority, who said, if I remember correctly, whatever Mark Rutte does, I will vote the opposite. So I think this is an indicator as well of the positioning, of the popular positioning towards certain issues, is like, if you don't support the government, you will not support, and this is the same with enlargement as well. If you don't trust the institutions, it goes deeper than the political, the government. If you don't trust the institutions, if you don't trust the EU institutions, you will not support as well the enlargement process.
And then there's this other finding that I found remarkable. A minority fears negative effects on key EU policies if the Western Balkans would join. The report shows those concerns mainly regarding having to do with democracy, with economic security, migration. Can you elaborate a bit more on what people told you?
Yes, I mean, they're depending on how they look at the issue, they obviously have different concerns. So if you look at, for example, the economic aspect, the jobs, the labor market, they were seeing enlargement in a positive way, you know. But if you look at housing in the Netherlands, and because of the crisis of housing, they were concerned that if more people come, this will only exacerbate this crisis. So depending on the way in which they look at it, obviously they position themselves differently. But then again, it doesn't really matter to them because this issue simply doesn't matter to them. Yeah. Yes, exactly. This,
or actually, it being not a salient issue to a Dutch majority. Florian, I saw an interesting post from you on Twitter on that part. The importance of enlargement for the EU in one picture, showing one man speaking to an empty hall while the European Parliament plenary debated the EP's recommendation for a new EU strategy for enlargement. You're laughing, but it's tragic at the same time, I would say. Why is it, would you believe, that in a general way the relevance is not felt, and how do you put the Dutch findings of this study in that general, neglectance actually of the issue?
Yes, and that gentleman was the commissioner in charge of enlargement, Oliver Verhey, who, in fact, the fact that he became commissioner from a country which has a very problematic record for democracy and rule of law already, I think, was a very problematic signal in the current commission for the enlargement portfolio, because it's ill-kept by somebody who's nominated by a government not well disposed towards democracy. And I think this is part of the problem, is that enlargement works if there's a political commitment to the process, both in the countries as well as in the European Union. And if it isn't there, it can't be reduced to a technical process which is just going to happen by itself, because it's a big political project, and it doesn't mean it, and it's often seen as a dichotomy. If you say it's political, then it's not about technicalities. Yes, of course you have to fulfill the acquis, of course you have to fulfill the conditions, but it's a political project. And I mean, and we forget that the enlargement of the Western Balkans began when the wars ended in the 1990s. It was about, the offer came about, this is the way to secure long-term peace in the Western Balkans, and it's only possible if the countries are in the European Union. And the war in Ukraine reminds us that war is the biggest, in a certain way, driver of EU integration, because countries are reminded of what is the risk of being not in a secure community of countries which are able to find a compromise jointly. And this is why the countries of the Western Balkans wanted to join. This is why Ukraine wants to join now. And you have to, in a certain way, come back to this political motivation of why enlargement matters. And this has been lost. And this is why, the plenary might be empty. And maybe it's just an unfortunate picture, but this was used, in fact, by the commissioner himself to promote his speech. So, you need a better PR person. You need a better PR person if you're doing that. But the point is really, you have to bring back the political importance of this. And in a certain way, this study is part of our effort from BiEPAG to say, we shouldn't, and nobody should hide behind citizens as an excuse not to take this process seriously. And it doesn't mean, of course, to drop the standards. It's not about not being demanding from the countries, but it's about saying this is what we want. This is in our interest, in the Dutch interest, in the Luxembourgish interest, in the Austrian interest, to complete this enlargement process and to, pull the full political weight behind it, because if it's not done, it is a source of future instability and failure of the European Union. So if we are in favor, and in a certain way it confirms that the Eurosceptics are against enlargement. So if we are actually in favor of the European Union as a political project, then we should also advocate enlargement as part of that. So it's in a certain way taking that logical conclusion from what citizens say at heart, and in a certain way, kind of rediscovering the political importance of it.
Right, but you've also found that even disapprovers are more open towards new members, as more countries would mean a stronger EU in a geopolitical term, an abstraction that we hear really often. I was just curious, how do citizens, people you interviewed, elaborate on this concept of a stronger EU in geopolitical terms? Can they relate to that?
I'll leave that to Sujan to answer, because he's been more doing the focus groups. So.
Yeah. It's really interesting to compare the Netherlands and France on that, because it wasn't such a long time ago. It was at the beginning of 2020 that we started. It was published in January 2021. So you had a 1 year break, and then we did this, well, less than a year. But the major factor that could change the opinion on those that were against in the Netherlands is criteria, observance of the criteria. In France, it was geopolitics. And if you listen to the speech of the President Macron at the beginning of the French presidency of the EU, it seemed as they almost verbatim quoted the findings of the research. I don't know if they did or just they did it themselves, but in any case, it was very curious to notice that they spoke what the French thought, because in France...
So no dissonances there?
Dissonances were before, and then it's changed. And in France, for example, in the focus groups that we did in Lyon, there was this supporter of Marine Le Pen, and when she was confronted with the maps, and when she saw that the countries are surrounded by the EU member states, she said, and she was against before that, she said, but why aren't they in the EU already? And that was the conclusion. So there, it was really this feeling that we need to be, if we are more, if we are together, we can then oppose other geopolitical players more efficiently. That worked much more with the French than here. Here it was really the criteria. Yeah.
But as we've seen in the second half of the presentation, while people in the Netherlands care about the criteria being upheld, they know little about them. Knowledge about the EU enlargement process and the candidates is not very profound across all profiles, is what you found. I was just wondering, if the Dutch know so little about the criteria and the process, what does that imply also for your study? I mean, would people remain so positive about enlargement if they would know better where they would be judging about?
I think this is what I cannot answer to you. Why the French? Exactly, because the French were much more knowledgeable about the criteria. I think that was really very different, and I think we asked them precisely the same questions.
And do you have an explanation why they know and we don't?
I don't personally. I was told that it was being taught more in the curricula in the schools, how it works. So that this could, or it was taught more. But in any case, this was given to us as a reason. Whether this is true or not, I cannot say. But I can just see the results, and that they, in that sense, they were more knowledgeable. When it comes to showing the Western Balkans correctly on the map, the result was pretty much the same, a little bit better than the Martian would do if he came to Earth right now. So.
But even some of the EU enlargement disapprovers are ready to change their attitude and are open towards new countries joining when these criteria are fulfilled, is what they told you, when the alignment is properly checked. Can you elaborate a bit more on what people say about the criteria whilst they don't have that much knowledge about it?
Well, we have to explain. They don't have the knowledge of how the system works, but they know what they imagine like the orderly European state should look like. So it implies democracy, functioning state, rule of law, and so on and so forth. So they know this, they just don't know how the actual, all the chapters, clusters, they don't have a clue about that, but they do know how a democratic EU member state should look like. And actually, to be perfectly honest, I think all of them, and this transpires in the focus group, think that these countries should look like the Netherlands.
The Netherlands, Wouter, is often seen as a skeptical member state when it comes to EU enlargement. Can we, after this study, still classify it as such? What do you think? And I'll ask you in a bit.
Not fully I don't think so, actually. I mean, I don't think
Negative
that we can keep these classifications as we've had them for a number of years now. Not only because this study shows that Dutch people are slightly more positive than we expected. There may be some effect, of course, of the war in Ukraine, so we would need a replication maybe in a year or two to see how support develops. But I think also, we touched upon it a little bit earlier. You can really question, are the countries that in the process take these criteria very seriously, are they really skeptical or are they just critical, right? And who are the actual real friends of enlargement, so to say?
But is that a semantic discussion, or would you say that there is a fundamental difference?
Well, I think if you classify it's in a way semantics. I mean, if you classify the Netherlands as skeptical, then that has then implications for how people see the Netherlands and how people see enlargement process continuing. And I think that if you there are also member states who, for other reasons that have nothing to do with the criteria and that may want to enlarge Europe not in a way that we see it fit, right? I think that therefore, it doesn't make sense to speak about the Netherlands per se. I mean, there is a certain skepticism on the political level in some political parties, maybe, but I wouldn't say it is useful to classify countries as fully skeptical, like countries at large.
I think that's a lovely bridge that you made there to the second half of our discussion. What do these findings, the findings of this study, imply for policymakers, for politicians also present here? Let's say, Wouter, maybe to be sure that we're all on the same page, because I know that some of you know very well, others won't. What is this strict and fair approach of the current Dutch government towards EU enlargement? What does it, just on a concrete level, very briefly, entail for those of you who don't really know?
Well, I think for Dutch, what I see in practice in any case is that there is, in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we have some representatives of the ministry here in the room, that I think there is quite an effort to try and be engaged on enlargement, to follow the process in an unbiased manner. And this is, I think, what is meant when Dutch politicians talk about the strict and the fair approach, to really follow the criteria, but to also make sure that if the criteria are fulfilled, that progress can be made. Now, unfortunately, I wouldn't say that the Netherlands always manages to also live up to the fair part. We've heard also about it from Thijs Reuten in the first session, that indeed sometimes there are specific files, say Kosovo visa liberalization, say the opening of accession talks with North Macedonia in 2019, where I think Dutch politicians have proved too hesitant, and the Dutch position was too hesitant to continue, and I do think that has harmed the process back then. So the strict and fair is there, I think, on the policy making level, but not always on the political level.
And could you briefly sketch for us, when it comes to Dutch political parties, we have one party present here and some others in the room, could you briefly sketch that and also point out what Jeroen's VVD, what strikes you in the position of the VVD approach in particular? And then we have you here to respond and to tell if he summarized it correctly, right?
I've looked at political party programs before, and what struck me in any case is that they're not so detailed. So there's also a reference to the criteria, and that those should be upheld, and that and I think the VVD also has on the website that we need to be strict on those criteria. But what I missed, and what I missed also in other party programs, is also the reference, or like what are we actually talking about? What countries, first of all? Where are they in the process? The fact that there is already an enlargement process going on for many years, I don't think that is something that many citizens know. So that's what I was missing a bit. And what I found interesting or funny specifically on the VVD position is that on the website it claimed that thanks to the VVD we are now monitoring the enlargement process very strictly in the EU at large, basically. And I think maybe there have been motions in Parliament calling for that strict monitoring, but I found that particularly interesting.
I read the same phrase and I was also fascinated. Jeroen, did Wouter summarize it well?
I won't. I'm not in a position to criticize the way he summarizes. I think it's a strict and fair summary.
A strict and fair summary, also to the point where you claim the success of the strictness of the process.
Well, I would hope so. I would hope that we can claim that, because
we being
the VVD.
The VVD.
Because to be frankly honest, I'd rather be blamed being too strict than being too fair. Let me be completely blunt and open about that. And the reason is that as a politician, as an elected politician, I always have to bear in mind the responsibility that was given to me to act on behalf of my constituents. And they are worried about illegal migration, about whether countries are on whose side they are, particularly regarding the war in Ukraine. I think the war in Ukraine, the outcome of the war in Ukraine will define the world our children will grow up in. So this is really a moment in history where countries have to decide on what side of history and on what side they want to stand. And these are two, I just give you two major issues, foreign policy and migration. And for both those issues are issues people worry about, not just in the Netherlands, but in many other countries. So I don't want to lower any standards, I don't want to drop any standards, and I don't want to be naive. And that's why I say I'd rather be too strict than too fair.
And let me use what you just said to zoom in a bit more on the usefulness of these kind of studies for politicians, for parties as well. Do you know actually what the constituency of your party thinks about EU enlargement? Does the VVD conduct any research? You know. Oh, great. Well, let's start with Jeroen and then we go to you. No, you first.
I think these studies are extremely useful because they give you a quantitative insight into where people stand. But
speaking for your constituency, I mean the VVD part of the society, would you know? Do you research it?
I don't know myself. I do know the party carries out these type of studies. However, I speak a lot to my constituents. Only you referred to it before when we were chatting, even yesterday evening. And so I do think I'm in the position to think that I know how they feel about these issues and where they want me to be strict. And on the other hand, but I'll get to that later, where we should be fair.
So, John Sweetie, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, I can just give the figures. So I think I would like to underline though that I think the fact of you speaking to the constituents is a big difference between you and your French colleagues, for example, on this matters. You know, the fact that here it does really matter. You know, foreign policy is something which is your prerogative in a way as a parliamentarian. Is really important. But on your voters, I don't know if you would be surprised that they're the most supportive of enlargement of all the political parties. I mean, maybe it depends on how you look at it. D66 has a larger chunk. They're more supportive overall if you look at the high salience and low salience approvers. But you have the most high salience approvers, 22%. 34, so it's 66 together. The 66 is 69.
And the
So
source of all this being your study.
Our
So
study,
you've also
yeah.
deferred to
Yeah,
political.
yes. So
preference.
the
Okay.
only clearly skeptical party is, no surprise, the party of Geert Wilders. But even there, you would have like about 30 to 40% of people who support it, actually. So
Reaction from Jeroen
Yeah.
to these statistics that just came up. They're not in the public report, are they? I'm also surprised. Okay. Why did you leave them out?
because we didn't want to politicize the research. So
Right.
Yeah.
We just did. Great. Jeroen,
Yeah.
short reaction.
I mean, I'm not that surprised because we've always been in favor of the European Union, and we've never been against EU enlargement, but it all depends at what pace, what country, and on what terms. And that's where the devil gets into the details. And I just mentioned two issues that are relevant when you talk about the conditionality. At which countries can join or not. So I think that's where the debate becomes
Starts.
more nuanced and also more complicated.
Is there something that you want to add about that debate now here for this panel discussion?
Yes, that I think the way the foreign policy of countries is of the utmost importance because of the war that I've just mentioned. And for instance, take a candidate country like Serbia, hosting many Russian companies, also not joining the EU sanctions. That's a country that wants to join, a country that has joined. Hungary, it's already in. I'm very worried about their position, and so are our constituents.
Florian, short reaction, or should we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I can briefly say. I mean, I think these are very good points, and I think I would say it's not so much about the. I think nobody doubts the fact that you need criteria, right? And I think there is a clear process. So I think from that point of view, this does not contradict actually enlargement, and I think it's more about I think communicating it differently, because in a certain way. One has to decide at which point is which condition useful. And I think in the enlargement process, we've seen that some conditions have been posed at the wrong time. So at the end of the day, I think it's very clear what a country needs to look like to join the European Union. It won't look like the Netherlands. There will be more mountains and other differences. But for example, anyhow, but we won't go. The bottom line is, how do you get there more effectively? And I think the strict but fair talk sometimes can sound a little bit like, you have to do everything now and then only you can join. And the question is really about timing and making it useful. I mean, we see it with Bosnia-Herzegovina waiting forever to get the candidate status when Ukraine got it. And it was because there were a lot of conditions put on very early, rather than saying, maybe you need a process going. And once the process is going, it's a lot easier to put in conditions, because there's a benefit to doing difficult things. And I think this is really what it's about. And that, and every individual country still has the veto powers at so many points. So even if the country doesn't do it now, it has to do it later. And the Netherlands, as any other country, can say, we're not satisfied with how things are going. So I think it's really about keeping the overall perspective and focusing on when things are achieved the best. Because if you say in the beginning, now you have to, for Serbia to say you have to now recognize Kosovo, you have to do this, and this, at a very early stage, might be much more difficult than at a point when actually membership and the benefits are more tangible. So I think one just has to think about the timing and when to be strict for what. That's, I think.
Yeah.
Angelina, I want to move over to you, also talking about the usefulness of these kind of studies. How would you say, does the EU take into account the attitudes of citizens of its member states on EU enlargement? Does it play a role in your decision-making process?
Yeah, well, the
Take
process itself,
the one from Serjan.
Let me first say, I mean, this discussion shows again that you need to discuss much more, and you need to really go back to the basics.
somebody said it's complex. It's very complex, but the basic facts of this whole enlargement is that you have countries who are waiting for more than 17 years to even start negotiating something with the institutions, and then it will be another 10 or 20 or how many years. And that's what Florian said also. It's such a long process. With every point in time, the Netherlands can say, oh, I don't agree. You know, it's 120 stations or more countries need to pass in this whole. So I think it's quite important that politicians, whatever party, explain to their citizens how this really works. And this is, I found this really interesting in this study, that it is, there's a lot of lack of knowledge, maybe even some you grabbed the geography on the misinformation, but I think there's a lot misinformation there. Do we look at citizens? We always take the barometer. Always. We are super aware of that distinction made to Western Balkans and Turkey, because you know, it takes a lot of our time too to look at the Turkey front. We also look, and this is why I have the iPad, we have the citizens in the region. The huge support for the European Union. Look at Albania, look at Bosnia-Herzegovina, look at Serbia even. You know, I say even because the support is always half-half, but then when I look at Albania, it's up to 80% of people who want their country to be a member of the European Union. That helps us so much in the work we are doing all over. So you have that dimension of citizens' will, but I must say, this, as I said before, this helps. This helps, I hope, also to have a broader debate in the Netherlands, to have politicians really discuss the real information about enlargement, what it really means, and why it's beneficial also in the end for the Netherlands, because that's the other question, you know. How does it benefit the Netherlands when Serbia becomes member? How is it really beneficial, the salient point? So, yes, we can do a lot with that, and I'm very happy it's out there. That's why I came. I want to contribute, but it needs to have even further and deeper work follow-up done. So,
if I might be so unpolite to put it a bit more on the point, since you are following all this from a Brussels perspective, are you saying actually the Dutch politicians are not outspoken enough about EU enlargement? Do they devote enough attention to the topic, as Mr. Reuter has also raised?
It's not just the Dutch politicians, huh? I think in general we have these. When I work for the institutions, I always say, with all respect to all politicians, there is not enough work done on explaining what the European Union does, what the policies are, what the decisions are made, and why. You had this. Somebody told you that Brussels is oppressive and it's stiffening, and you know, in the. Of course, that is the image that's being given, but. Can we please ask all politicians of all parties across the European Union to explain what we are doing, why we're doing it? And they are the ones who are making the decisions, by the way, in Brussels. It's not Brussels itself. So Brussels is member states. But I think particularly on enlargement, don't forget that when every 4 years or every 2 years, but every 4 parliamentary elections, when Dutch citizens vote, you have the stemwijzer. You can have your 30 questions on what you want political parties to stand for. There is always a question on the uitbreiding, on the enlargement. Are you in favor or not? And I'm always happy when I see that, because then I think, okay, so there must be somewhere a discussion during the elections about enlargement. But enlargement is not part of the election debate, unless you tell me it's different. But it's not out there. And maybe also for good reasons. But again, I really think there is much, much more work to done. Also by media, by the way. Is Dutch media really paying attention to enlargement? You mentioned the tranen van Tito. Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful source for people to make you think differently. But there is, I think, generally there's very little interest to explain what's happening in Southeast Europe.
Let me assure you, there are broadcasting organizations that do, but
I'm happy to promote them.
Jeroen, just a brief reaction to what Angelina just said.
I think enlargement is very much an EU terminology. Whenever I hear enlargement, I always think there can be no enlargement without alignment. So that's, for me, it's two sides of the same coin. I think, but you have a point. I think it's important that we as politicians explain to people that, especially this time in history, how the necessity and the relevance of international cooperation between Western countries that share the same value systems and that are geographically bound together. And why is this important? Because we have a new enemy in the East. New, well, relative. The question.
You mean China? Sorry.
No, I'm referring to Russia, of course.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So,
Yes.
so no, but this is why it's very important that we support countries, that we pull them towards the European Union, that we support countries also on the outskirts of the European Union, including defense cooperation. I mean, I wish we would have started earlier helping Ukraine. It's thankfully the US started doing that.
But maybe to come back to the responsibility that politicians have to come with messages for domestic audiences about the EU, positive messaging, as I hear you saying. It turns out that it's sometimes rather difficult for them to tell the same story for domestic audiences as for the audience in Brussels.
Yes, you're absolutely right. But I think we carry responsibility of explaining why it's relevant that we work together, that those countries align with EU foreign policy, with all the EU regulations. This is not just a legal ticking the box exercise, I'd like to add. It has a political dimension because one chapter becomes more relevant over time. I already referred to the foreign policy of certain countries.
Angelina, and then I go to you, Serjan.
Yes, I just want to add a bit to this the notion of alignment. There is absolutely no question you become member of the European Union, and that is not different after or before 24th of February, if you don't align. It's one of the key criteria. Aligning, I'm sure everybody is fully aware, but you really stand up on declarations, on sanctions. No, but this is a core. It's core of the whole enlargement process. So this is not new. It's not new.
Waiting time should not be a criteria either. I mean, if a country is waiting for already 17 years, it means they don't align for 17 years.
That is absolutely not. I'm sorry. This is not correct. But some countries had to wait for many different reasons, and it was not because of them not aligning. It was, I don't even want to. You happy to go into the story of North Macedonia? We lived it together for too long. And that was not about alignment. So, I mean, let's be very clear. And my last point on strict and fair criteria, all European Union member states want the candidate countries and the negotiating countries to abide by strict and fair. So this is not something for the Netherlands only. This is really all of them in the room stay on these criteria. So maybe we can look a little bit beyond that and see, and that's what you did in the study, and that's why I'm grateful.
Serjan.
I would maybe like to shift the burden and the attention away from the politicians here to the politicians in the Western Balkans, actually.
Interesting.
And
what is their task in all this?
And to link it to the research, I think if you want to know who truly wants to join the EU, look at where they put their money, if they have this money. Go and check the Open Secrets website, to see who gives money to the lobbying firms in DC. And then compare this from the Western Balkans countries. Compare this to the amount of money that they would spend on promotion of their country and lobbying in the EU and in Netherlands concretely. We know that the money is short, but it's never short to put it there, and it's somehow short to give more money to the embassies, to do activities, so I think, and what we managed to show in this research is this has a direct impact on the support for enlargement. So if you go to the Balkans, If you know somebody from the Balkans, I repeat that, the 100 times more likely you'll be to support enlargement. We managed to show this clearly, exactly in the research. So I think this is where also we should look, what are they actually doing, the politicians? I'm not saying the diplomatic representatives, because it's in their interest obviously to promote their countries. They would love to have more money. They don't. Why don't they? I think that's a look at that, and I did, and you can see.
This is the positive messaging, right?
I think it's the positive messaging because it can be done. It can be done,
But then can you make it a bit more concrete? Because you note that in your research. What can these positive messages entail, and who actually should send them? I hear politicians, or is it civil society?
No, not the politicians, and that's the point. I mean, that's what we managed to see in France. We didn't do the structured elite interviews that we had here. We did them after we published the study, not before. And what we could see is if the country is promoted not by the government representatives, is better. So a banal thing like an ad for North Macedonia on the bus service in The Hague would banally contribute more than anything else to the citizens actually maybe going there and then supporting. So even a tourist promotion campaign, chambers of commerce, cooperation, the economic cooperation, everything. So
since you shifted the perspective towards, let's say, the perspective of the Balkan region that prevail in the Netherlands, the study shows that those perceptions range from war, corruption, poverty, to natural beauty and friendliness. Would you say, do Dutch people hold many stereotypes? It sounds that way.
But like we all do, in the Western Balkans, we also have stereotypes about the Dutch, I guess. But the thing is, you could clearly see the difference. The approvers tended to have more positive stereotypes, and the disapprovers, and we were able to show that as well, had the negative stereotypes were more dominant, like corruption, poverty, and so on.
Right. Since we're entering the last 5 minutes for this conversation, I would like to shift towards what should be done now. You've already started with a very practical solution, but maybe some more recommendations from your part.
Exactly. So I think clear recommendation, this is why I spoke about the countries of the Western Balkans, is for them to read these studies and to draw conclusions from them and maybe do them themselves a bit more. And the second thing is do more research. We would love to do more research, and obviously we would.
What stops you from doing it? Yeah, no, that's the banal answer I could also figure out. But let's try to move a bit further than that consultation.
Well, that's really the only obstacle. We have so many people in BiEPAG that we have the manpower, we have the knowledge, we have the great partnership with DPART, we have partnership with similar organizations like Clingendael in other capitals and member states that we can activate. So it's really just that. It's nothing more than that. Yeah.
Banal as it is. That advertisement has just been made. Florian.
No, I think the message that getting to know the region, getting to know the Western Balkans for EU citizens is, I think, a very positive one, because it's showing that actually experience and exposure changes attitudes in a good way. And if you've been to the region, we all know also the difficulties, and I think nobody is trying to say everything is fine, everything is good, but it shows, and I think it's about empathy and understanding. It doesn't mean to say we want to take, we go there for holidays and so everything is great and we're going to uncritically accept the countries. But it's about feeling empathy and starting to feel like they're also European citizens. And and in a certain way, this is what we've also been, as BiEPAG, often been arguing is, we need to include, when we talk about alignment, we also need to make sure that decision makers in the Western Balkans are included in these processes. When we had the COVID crisis and medical equipment was banned from the EU to be exported to the Western Balkans, it created a lot of bad blood because there was a sense of, we want to join, but you excluded something which is a matter of life and death. This was corrected, but it was these first moments which created a very kind of alienating. And the same when the sanctions were discussed and discussions were about how to compensate countries who joined the sanctions. The Western Balkans were not consulted, but were expected to align. And I think, again, it doesn't excuse anybody not imposing sanctions, but it makes it easier to make excuses. And I think you have to think of the region as part of the European project. And it's about citizens, understanding that citizens in the Western Balkans share many of the same concerns, many of their life experiences and so on, but also to kind of, at the political level, to kind of bring them in, which doesn't mean you agree, but you in a certain way think of them as future EU countries. And I think it's this kind of mental jump which also is shown in the study, and I think we need to go in that direction, which I think does open doors in many ways.
Wouter, as a Dutch specialist on EU enlargement, what is the value for you, would you say, of this study? How will you use it in your future work?
In any case, it makes my life way easier when I travel to conferences and all kinds of places in Europe to explain what is this Dutch position about enlargement and how do Dutch people think about it. So that will be one answer.
It's research-based, what you tell.
Exactly. But the other thing for me, what this study makes me realize, that we also need to start at the EU itself, I think, and the functioning of the European Union, explaining how the EU works to citizens. I think it's also very important to show that the EU delivers when it comes to economic security, when it comes to hard security, when it comes to other issues that matter for citizens. And I think this study really shows that maybe in one way we need to talk more about the Western Balkans and make sure that people realize, hey, this is a part of our European community. On the other hand, we need to talk more about the EU and the things that go wrong there, and what can be improved in EU policy making. And that doesn't mean that only if we talk more about the EU or that we are also only need to be positive. No, we exactly need to see where are things going wrong when it comes to decision making. Also, because when the EU will further enlarge in the future, then we will need to think about how will the decision making processes work then, and can we have a functioning EU? We already have 27. I think it wouldn't necessarily be a problem to have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 more countries joining. But still, there would need to be, the decision making is already under pressure. So,
and that makes it difficult, I guess, to be more honest. What you actually ask
Sorry,
politicians to be. Well, if you say we have to tell the honest story, Angelina, maybe a response from you. Is that possible in this already very polarized environment?
You always have to say the honest story. I'm sorry. Thankfully, I'm not a politician, so I can just say all of that. But well, obviously, but you always have to say the honest story, and you have to make sure that the stories are being told, because that is basically what leaders missing also in the region. They don't have a nice story to tell anymore. They don't have positive stories, so all of that. But what a few points I want to take from the study, because there's one we didn't talk about. It's a minor point, but our distinguished member of the European Parliament will like it, that the Dutch have more trust in the European Parliament than in their own institutions. Bingo. I mean, it's quite interesting, because yeah, you saw it, right? Do you want to repeat them again?
I do know them by heart.
Do you know them by heart? It's a tiny difference. Yes. It's a tiny difference, but it's right. You know, in these studies, what always intrigues me a lot is the 22% I don't know, and a little bit extra of the real naysayers. But then when you dig deeper, they actually don't mind at all. So there's a lack there. There's a lot of urgency for explanation, information, debate, and also, know, putting people literally on the bus to Montenegro and, you know, see how it is, or to Kosovo or to elsewhere. This is important because how is it that 22% people don't know? And that's always, I leave that to the politicians. But it does help for me, and to just sum up in one line, it does help me a lot back in Brussels, indeed, when sometimes you hear a very rigid Netherlands position also in the parliament in Netherlands, and you can actually see, but hey, citizens seem to think perhaps more nuanced in all of this.
And maybe on this point of the knowledge and how to know better what we talk about, also for you, what you personally could do to help to come to a better understanding?
Personally, I mean, we try from the institutions to as much as possible to bring the information out there, but this is very much a joint effort. I mean, two things. I will take it back to say, can we help doing this elsewhere in the EU for sure, and can we help actually generate through our own strategic communications, people and other comms people and the media we have out there to have that debate going more.
Already a very practical promise. Yes, Serjan?
People from the European External Action Service in their private capacity have taken part in the same way as Wouter did in shaping of the questionnaires, and so both for the French and Dutch research they were really helpful in that sense.
Point made. Jeroen, famous last words for you.
I think I've said enough famous words already, but I take away from the...
No, he has he's mic'd, yes.
What I take away from the authors, and I thank them for that, is that it's what you see is people connect to people, and it's important to, and it's an important responsibility also for me as a liberal politician, that we always take into account what it matters to the people in prospective EU countries, and how it would improve their lives, and that's an important factor that we should always include in the equation, together with all the other factors I've mentioned. What's the country doing against illegal migration? What's its foreign policy, etc., etc. But in terms of fairness, I think it's very important that we also remain fair to the people. And then I agree with Wouter that the whole enlargement process as such, and an ever larger European Union becomes inherently problematic and harder to manage. Especially, for instance, foreign policy. How can we have an effective foreign policy with unanimity? This is something with use of the passerelle clause we should look at, because it's already difficult now. I mean, as we speak with the position of Hungary, for instance, it's already difficult now, let alone when new countries join. So this is something we should also bear in mind with the whole enlargement process. But in the end is what's important, and that's the geopolitical aspect of it. I'm at Clingendael, so I can use the word geopolitical. Is that it's important that we pull those countries towards us, as opposed to pushing them away in the wrong direction.
Room for discussion. Thank you very much for this discussion. Angelina Eichhorst, Jeroen van Wijngaarden, Wouter Sweers, Serjan Svijic, and Florian Bieber. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for contributing today. Thank you all. Thank you, and have a lovely afternoon. And of course, all speakers will be present for further questions later on after the program has finished. Thank you very much.
Ja, goede discussie.